Hello and welcome to PFI Talks, brought to you by Prague Finance Institute, an affiliate of the leading Czech economics research center, Sergej EI. My name is Leos Rusek, and I'm the head of communications at PPF Group and also the host of this podcast. It is my great pleasure to welcome Anat Admati, a finance and economics professor at Stanford University. Time magazine named Anat Admati as one of the top 100 most influential people in the world, and Foreign Policy magazine including her in their first of 100 global thinkers, or top 100 global thinkers. She's the co-author of the influential book, The Banker's New Clothes, a scathing critique of the banking system and its lack of meaningful reform since the 2008 financial crisis. We're going to talk about this and a lot more. Hello.
Hello, and thank you.
Well, I'll riff off those accolades, yeah? I mean, those accolades of like Foreign Policy and Time magazine, and there's a few more, and a great reviews of your book that's actually gone into second print, if I'm correct, earlier this year.
A new edition with 200 extra pages.
And a new edition with 200, okay, good to know.
And it's cheap. It's cheap for being so big and half in a foot in a note, so it's a lot of information for almost no money.
Oh, perfect. That's a really great plug-in.
Yeah.
But we want to talk about this book. But first, of course, in that book and in some of your writings, I mean, you've actually used your influence to, challenge the big people in the banking system and the current banking corporate world, including JP Morgan Chase CEO, Jamie Dimon. So in your view, what is Jamie Dimon doing wrong?
It depends on whose perspective. He's doing very right by himself, by his company. Maybe by some definition, his shareholders, although I probably own a few shares and I don't like what he does because his model is confusing. He's saying things that are really wrong and misleading, and he's helping to distort the rules to benefit himself and his fellow bankers, while society and even the politicians either don't know or don't want to know what to do. So, you mentioned all these accolades, and I will mention one that I don't get, and that is that I'm not powerful. I mean, that's the problem. I can be influential, but influence will only take you so far these days. Or a thinker, that takes you even worse.
What would you like to do with the power if you get it?
If I had power, I would regulate the banks a lot better. I would, SVB, even Credit Suisse probably wouldn't have happened the way they did if I had my way.
But the banks, they always argue that there's too much regulation, we need scale because, we have to comply with all that stuff, and especially banks that are somehow maybe involved in dealing with something that's actually on some sort of restriction list or anything, that our compliance departments are too huge and we have to pass on the costs.
So Jamie Dimon likes to talk about spaghetti and all these regulations and all these regulators. It's true, it's very complicated, especially in the US, and there are lots of agencies and all of that. And it's true that even the rules that the book focuses on, which are meant to do something very simple, which is to shift the downside risk back to the investors and not to depositors and not to debt holders, but to equity holders. It's so simple. And all other companies without regulations have so much more of that equity funding, and the banks are so insistent that they somehow can't do that. And all it's about is about, their need for subsidies. And so, yes, there are a lot of regulations, and the regulation specifically about this is way too complicated with all these complicated risk weights and all of that. Well, complicated doesn't mean good. It just allows them to obscure the issues ever farther and to pick up fights on the details while also fighting against simpler things that I'm proposing. So what I'm proposing is much simpler, and they hate that too.
Would it be fair to say, sort of characterize what you propose in terms of simplifying the regulation to going back to sort of like good old style, let's say 19th century partnership banks, when the bankers actually had their skin in the game?
Well, we don't want to go as far as partnerships, because in partnerships, who's going to want to own a bank if they actually, certainly nothing like a big bank like today. But we're talking about, if JP Morgan Chase was a partnership, JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon's actual assets will be on the line to pay back everything. And of course, we don't want to have all these safety nets in 19th century they didn't have. So they actually were on their own. Now, when they were on their own, partnerships or later, increased, double or triple liability. In other words, the shareholders were still, couldn't walk away and had to pay up a little bit more if the bank couldn't. You couldn't trade shares easily. It would be some problems. But if you want shares to be, sort of limited liabilities, then you just have to have much more of the funding coming from limited liability shareholders. And so that would achieve the objective of the bank being able to absorb losses on the risks it takes and pay back depositors and other creditors without needing bailouts or taking the world down.
Well, in the book that we mentioned, and thanks for actually, pointing out that the new edition is effectively a completely new book.
It's the old book plus 200 pages. Yeah.
Okay, fine. Is it correct to actually look at it the way that, you described in 2013 when the book came out, it was supposed to reflect on what went wrong in the 2008 crisis? And
in the reforms.
And then you and your co-author, you guys decided to go back to it because you think that the world hasn't, or the banking world hasn't learned from the mistakes?
It's not the banking world. We were addressing our books to the public and to the policymakers. I'm not expecting the banking, an individual banker to come and say, oh, you know what, I'll give up some of my subsidies. They won't do that. I'm a finance professor. This is a competitive world out there. The only way you get banking to work is to actually, commit the entire sector to being healthier. And that's from external forces, from regulation, because, we wrote various papers about what would happen to laissez-faire banking, and it would just be inefficient. In other words, when people say banks have always been fragile, the original sin, and banks are born with a fundamental conflict of interest between the banker and the depositor over risk and over equity. That's fundamental to banking. The way this is solved is through, in a normal corporation, it is a little bit addressed through debt covenants. In other words, the creditors are putting conditions. Regulations is the equivalent of that. Regulation says, the depositors are unsecured. They don't even have collateral and they don't want to monitor. The regulator will monitor on their behalf. That's what's happening. Now, coming back to the book was a crazy idea. Actually, I still cannot believe we did that because,
You mean the original original
not
edition?
touch the original material. We just started with what was supposed to be a chapter, then it was 2 chapters, then it was 3 chapters, and then it ended up with 4 chapters. And even they are a little bit longer on average than the original chapters because there was a lot to say. So the new part is called Undermining Democracy and the Rule of Law. So the first part was mostly about the economics and a little bit about the politics of the regulation. Mm-hmm. This time we continue and say why they didn't do what we do. We reinforce some of our economic arguments. We enhance the book by explaining a lot more about central banks because they became ever more important, since the crisis and then once again in COVID and now. So they become really part of the, bailouts forever and all of that, jumping to save everybody around. And so we explain how they work this time, which we didn't in the previous edition. And there's a lot more politics and a lot more law. So the last chapter is called Above the Law with a question mark. But, we now go around joking that we should have put an exclamation mark about being above the law. Because if you're too big to fail, you can be HSBC and the UK government is going to call the US government and say, please be gentle, or, it's going to be a Lehman moment. In other words, you're too big to jail, what they call.
And that's probably why you always, when I actually listen to your lectures that are actually available on YouTube, and there's a lot of them, this is a plugin for our viewers, you should Google Anat Admati on YouTube. You talk a lot about narrative, and that narrative is actually very important in terms of setting the policy. So can you walk us through that, how you actually really look at that?
Yeah, so, narratives are a form of power. And narratives will take you all the way to the court. You can convince a judge even, but you certainly can convince politicians if they don't really understand the issues. And maybe they again, don't want to understand the issues. So you can use jargon that they don't understand. It's like the Emperor's New Clothes. That's the source of the title of the book. The Banker's New Clothes refers to just flawed narratives in banking. I mean, that's what it's about, that the substance is like the Emperor's New Clothes. There's no substance. So the substance is wrong. Back in 2010, we wrote a paper that divides it up to fallacies, irrelevant facts, and myths. So fallacies are just false statements, just falsehoods, wrong jargon. You don't know what you're even talking about. You're confusing two sides of a balance sheet, all of that. Irrelevant facts are, it's expensive for me not to reach into your pocket and steal your money. I would prefer to reach into your pocket and steal your money. But society decided I shouldn't. So expensive for whom? When they say it's expensive for me to give up subsidies, we are the ones giving the subsidies. You're using the subsidies for your own good. And then when there's losses, other people suffer more. So you disproportionately benefit from the upside, the magnified upside of the leverage, and you leave the downside to others. And there is this implicit threat of collateral harm if you're not bailed out or if you somehow suffer consequences. And their banker takes the bonuses, the way they measure things, whatever. In any case, a lot of narratives come to justify why banks should be allowed to have so little equity funding as they have. And I have a lot of papers in economics and finance that explain the addictiveness of being so indebted, so heavily indebted. You basically, in banking especially, you can live as an insolvent bank, what's called a zombie, for a long time because you don't default and nobody sees it. So as long as nobody looks too hard and you can massage it in your accounting somehow, and you can fool your regulators, or the way they set the regulation is such that you can game it and appear strong by their metrics, then you can live on borrowed money. And at that point, you hate equity with a particular passion. To me, the incredibly fierce battle over this issue only suggests that I'm right, because by itself, the hate of equity is evidence that you have very little of it, too little. So anyway, the narratives are all over the place. By the time now, I don't want to take more time, but I want to refer your viewers, listeners, to a document on the website, but look at the latest one because we keep updating it. The last edition as we speak is April 8th, 2024. And it is called The Parade of Bankers' New Clothes Continues, which is even after you call the emperors naked, they keep saying these things and come up with variations of them that sound maybe plausible. Empty threats, disingenuous threats. I won't make this loan if you do this. The board will come apart. What about the shadow banks? On and on and on. 44 flawed claims debunked. 44. And they're now grouped into banks are special, terrible things will happen, the regulations are hard enough, et cetera, debunking one by one, briefly, on citing other places for more debunking, all the different claims that are made by different people in this space that we hear, that we have heard, that we have citations for. Sometimes in academic papers, regulatory documents, newspapers, quotes from bankers, from regulators, from politicians, etc., journalists. Journalists explaining things wrong, all of that.
And also in the book, you've just referred to it several times during our discussion, and it's a subsidy of the bank. And in the book, you call it an infinite subsidy, which you say that there were, in the way the banking sector was bailed out post-2008 or 2009 crisis, was the fact that some of the agencies were actually, government agencies were giving money to the banks so the banks could pay another part of the government, whatever they got earlier. So it was this living on some sort of a credit, but through a subsidy. And you called it an infinite subsidy.
Infinite subsidy is not my words. It's actually the words of Mark Zandi, who's a top economist chief economist of Moody's, the credit rating agencies. When asked about a particular program that did what you just said, where one agency guaranteed the bank's debts that they raise in private markets so that they could pay back on bailout money from the Treasury Department here, which constrained them a little bit more. And he said that, basically that the subsidies is infinite. It's the whole franchise value is what he said. And the reason is that if you're a corporation that always has access to funding, and nobody is allowed to nobody, everybody's scared to let you default on any promise you make, then you can always live. And you can grow, and now I tell a story of, the borrower, because we have a fictitious borrower in a household, a woman named Kate who borrows money to buy a house. And when her aunt tells her that she will guarantee her mortgage, then she wants a big house and she doesn't want to put any of her own money in it. She says to her aunt, equity is expensive because I don't want to subject my money to the risk of the house value going down. You bear that.
So in terms of going back to the narrative and what could have been done better in 2000 or post-2009 great financial crisis, would you then argue for letting big banks actually collapse?
No, I'm not. I'm talking about prevention. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I'm talking about making it less likely that they will need either failed mechanisms or bailouts, or they'll take down the entire system. In other words, we can look at the system and try to simplify the system. Breaking up an institution, my line on that is that if they lived on more equity, they would shrink on their own inefficient weight. Because, we don't see $4 trillion corporations and a lot off balance sheet in the real world, not even the largest tech companies. Asset.
Okay.
More than $4 trillion is JP Morgan Chase. That's unfathomable size of a corporation and complexity. Investors won't go for it. It's too opaque. It's too complex. If there weren't the guarantees. The only way they survive in this current form is the implicit and explicit guarantees.
So in your way of looking at things, the tier one type of a measure for the equity is not the proper yardstick that we should be using in banking.
It was flat through the crisis, all these metrics. And what they did afterwards, they tweaked a little bit of them. They didn't change the structure of it, and they changed the numbers minimally. They'll tell you a lot, but as Martin Wolf said, right when they published Basel III, he said, if you triple zero, you get zero. So if you triple a very small number, so they say, whoa, we tripled, we increased it by X%. Well, it was very small to begin with. So percentage of a small thing, it doesn't add very much. If you say I have a speed limit of 90 miles an hour, 90 kilometers an hour, and, I reduced it to 88, okay, but it depends where you start from. And then if you start with 10, you quintupled it or whatever.
So at the moment, the tier one capital ratio, we're starting in very single digits, relative to the balance sheet. And so what should the ratio of the capital to the balance sheet be?
Well, okay, so all depends how you measure, but in order to say, we're not in the right range, we don't have the right number of digits, our proposal goes back not to the partnership days, but, about a century ago, with fewer safety nets. Before the prevalence of deposit insurance, banks routinely had 25% equity. And in fact, companies outside banking, even ones that engage in lending, often have that kind of equity funding, despite the fact that very misguidedly, we all subsidize corporate borrowing over equity. So on one hand, it adds fragility. On the other hand, we subsidize it. Shoot yourself in the foot, they call it. In other words, how perverse it is to subsidize debt over equity for all corporations, but especially for banks, to give them a tax kick on top of it. It makes no sense. But even despite that, you just have to say, well, your norm should be, 25% equity to total. If they say they can't live like that, the question is, why not? If they just pay the dividend, they could use that money to lend. I'm even letting them grow, except with equity. In other words, you retain your earnings, you build up your equity.
And you would still keep the FDICs and FDIC-like institution in place, or would you rather see them?
Yeah, I would leave deposit insurance in place, but I would reduce the footprint of that insurance. Right now, what's going on?
What do you mean by that, the footprint?
I would mean by that is that we will need, right now, the FDIC, the way FDIC works, and in other countries, it's just direct government. They don't have always a separate corporation that does insurance. I would say a few things about that, by the way, about insurance of deposits. If you had like a private company insuring the banks, depositors, There's no way a bank like JP Morgan Chase would have gotten insurance in private markets for the $2.5 trillion of deposit it has. No way. It's uninsurable. Their deposits are uninsurable in markets. The only way this works is because the Fed is going to always make sure JP Morgan Chase pays because they're too afraid of the consequences if it defaults on anything. Now, okay, it may have buffers, but the deposits are sitting there and not coming for their money. So that's a great way to be if you have that kind of money walk in the door. So, but here's the point. The too big to fail banks are a complete perversion of every capitalist idea you can have. They don't live in markets hardly at all. I mean, they're just too coddled, too entitled, and too reckless. Okay, so the more equity is going to force their price of their equity down on account of they bear more risk, which is legitimate, on account that they're finding them too opaque, which is true. And the FDIC is now charging banks when it needs to come in and resolve SVB or First Republic. It charges the banks and it sells the failed banks to somebody else. And that is funded by taxing the rest of the system, which in a crisis, of course, is also very difficult to do because everybody is unhealthy at that point. So this system should be able to push the risk back into the private sector, but still be there because I don't want depositors runs, because they're nervous. Depositors runs, the FDIC and deposit insurance was motivated by depositors not wanting to monitor. And up to a point, we should have a payment system that doesn't require people to worry about the ATM having money. So, I don't want depositors to be nervous about their money. So I'm okay with deposit insurance to a point, but certainly not infinite the way it effectively is. That breeds recklessness by the banks and certainly accompanied by regulation to counter the incentives. And even insurance companies there's both this corporate leverage addiction and insurance moral hazard that applies to all insurance. If you are fully insured, you might not be careful. We know that. Insurance companies know that. They'll have a deductible, they'll have copayment, they'll have some, you have to lock your house, your car, whatever. You know what I mean? They will want to demand some safety. That's all.
So to sum it up, you would still keep some form of deposit insurance, but the deposit insurance that it's not actually really beholden to like emergency taxation funding, even post fact.
No. I mean, it's fine however they're funded, but it should just be less needed.
Less needed. Then increase the equity and probably create a greater number of institutions because by the demand of the equity, Not necessarily. Not necessarily. I mean, some small banks might be not viable either. There seemed to be inability to close even small banks in Europe. And they need pressure. Italy needed pressure from other countries, and then it was politically unpopular to close even the smaller banks that are not systemic. In the U.S., you may have too many banks that are unhealthy. Thousands and thousands of banks that might be too small for scale. I want healthy banks, and if the big banks shrink, that would be a good thing. But they will shrink on their own of pressure from investors. That's what I want. Natural shrinkage. They'll sell some assets. And by the way, much of the banking sector is done not in these banks. They're just like big hedge funds with the deposit funding. I mean, how much loans? I mean, I speak about this in my, they give you the impression that what they do with deposits and other money that they have is make loans to individual poor people or something. No, they don't even lend the deposits. JP Morgan Chase has $2.5 trillion of deposits right now. I mean, I haven't looked yesterday, but about that. And the amount of things it calls loans, where somehow banks are special and it's called a loan and not a security or not something in the financial markets, is only about $1 trillion. So less than half of the deposits, but the total balance sheet is about $4 trillion. So they're only lending not much more than a quarter of their total assets. The rest is what? The rest is financial securities, trading securities, all kinds of other things that anybody can do with any money. They don't have to do it with so much deposit money. originally in your
worse.
career, I think, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think you just answered that. I'm going to ask a question, but I think you've already answered it. But it may be worth summing it up because you originally focused on corporate finance, corporate lending, and then through writing the book or the papers, as you just described, you got into the financial regulation with the with
after
the
the
big scope.
crisis.
So, is it a detour in your academic career, or is it a sort of a new direction?
It was a turn. It was a turn into banking and back out to corporate governance to realize that I was wrong to focus, which I did before the crisis, on shareholder activism or the entire internal nexus of shareholders, directors, managers. Because the biggest problems come in the interface between corporations and the law and society. In other words, external governance on corporations, not the internal corporate law type of governance. That's about fiduciaries of boards and how you align shareholders with managers and all of that. That is not that is a problem too, because managers could take the money to themselves, all of that, and shareholders have to monitor. So I'm all for that. But many times the corporation has an ability to harm society. Banks can do that. Opioids, Boeing, Volkswagen, etc. I mean, one of the biggest scandals, apropos, getting interested in the law, is in Europe. Cum-Ex, it's called. We discuss it in the book. This is a tax fraud done by all European banks. We were talking about bailing out one agency, bailing out another. How about stealing from your treasury? Stealing taxpayer money. And how about doing it under the nose of the regulators and the authorities for years, even while you're bailed out? That's what happened in Europe. Banks were engaging in direct tax fraud, giving treasuries receipts for 2 payments when they are deserving only 1 for tax credits, for tax refunds. It's called Cum-Ex. 150 billion euros were stolen from different countries, 36 out of Germany, estimates right now, over a period of like 15, 20 years at least. We don't know how back it goes. And the trials are still going on. But this was all the banks, pretty much all the banks in Germany or in most of Europe, in cahoots with some investors in Europe and US. How is that possible? That's what I'm saying. The key is, first and foremost, get the rules of society to be written properly and enforced properly on corporate persons, because we created corporations in the law. They are separate persons. They're not humans, but they're persons in the law. How does society enforce law, compel a corporation to abide by the law when they have so much power and they employ people and all of that? Governments seem overwhelmed by the power in the private sector of big private institutions and their leaders. So we have now a situation in which the balance of power in democracies, in capitalist democracies or democratic capitalism, the way Martin Wolf calls it, the balance of power is such that society has kind of lost control. And that's what concerns me now, is sort of this crisis of democratic capitalism, or the intertwined crisis of democracy and capitalism, where the forces of capitalism have kind of overwhelmed the democratic institutions. And deception is a big part of it in general.
Well, you just made me think about, because we are taping it after U.S. presidential elections.
Yeah.
It's going to take us some time to produce and actually put it online. We're not extremely efficient. I have to actually admit that flaw. So probably, maybe, it's evergreen content. Yeah, it's evergreen content. So let's assume that, because about a couple of days ago, Elon Musk was actually really nominated to become the chief deregulator of the U.S. government. But in some way, maybe you would sort of like maybe agree with him going into the sort of back to the instincts, not like getting lost in the maze of regulation. Wouldn't there be some sort of a speck of...
No, you will not. You will not find a lot of good words from him, Elon Musk. I mean, I'm against inefficient, bloated, agencies and all of that. So, we all want, effective institutions that are just the size and capacity and competence that they need to have. But, we know from, a book by Michael Lewis called The Fifth Risk and others that, Donald Trump has no serious understanding of what it takes to create good rules. And especially speaking of corruption, I mean, Elon Musk and Donald Trump are extremely personally conflicted on many, many issues. And Elon Musk's profits often come from government contracts. And it is a scary thought, the extent of conflicted people involved in setting rules for everybody that affect them directly. Those things are not supposed to happen. The rules should be set by unconflicted people. And the extent of, you could call it crony capitalism is going to explode, I'm afraid. And of course, the narratives and the lies are everywhere these days. It's a scary world, post-fact world, where basic facts are denied. And that's since when we wrote the book, it was like you thought at least facts had some meaning. Truth had some meaning. In the new edition, we end the book not by saying that we need to speak truth to power, but that we need to empower truth. We need to give truth more power. That's a big challenge in today's world. Truth is a start, agreeing on facts should be the start of political discourse, in our democracies. And when you have so many lies that bombard people, together with, sure, some people like strong leaders, some people agree on certain policy issues, all of that is legitimate. But when you don't have norms of democracy, when lying is okay, when not tolerating your rivals is, when your rivals are your enemy of the people and all this language, that is very, very insightful language that is very scary to many people. And so I'm very concerned with democracy ability to deliver. We will see. I mean, there could always be a mix of useful things that end up happening and on the rest of it. But certainly it's not, it's coming from certain set of beliefs, but some of these beliefs include excessive hubris and thought that you know best. Disregard of all competent experts. And that's all, I have a lot of criticism, and the book has a lot of criticism of experts, including economists in our tribe. So we are a little whistleblowing there on narratives of economists, on focus on efficiency, all kinds of narratives that economists tell, even in mathematical models. But it's at a different level when the public discourse is so full of nonsense. I mean, and we quote at the end of the book a book from 1985 about the media called "Amusing Ourselves to Death," and it was written about the prevalence of cable TV by a media person, Neil Postman. The book was republished in 2005. 2005 already had the internet and a lot of, talk show, radio, and other things like that. And the notion that we're bombarded with so much information, nobody sorts it out, and it's free speech and all of that. And the amount of confusion that can be created, and influencers throwing narratives at people, and who knows, and all speech, paid speech is, and political speech becomes so, confusing to people and misleading, and diverting their attention from where the problems are elsewhere, and fomenting hate and all of that. That's very concerning. And he was saying political discourse has become nonsense. This is at the days of complaining about short TV clips and breaking for commercials and people needing to look good on TV and all of that. The rise of lots of channels TV. Consider social media on mobile these days, and everything gets multiplied a lot more. So the media space is such, and the political discourse is such that it's very difficult environment to operate for anybody who cares about the public and speaks truth. I mean, there are a lot of these voices, but they get drowned sometimes.
I was going through the last bits of my questions, and you've actually answered it, so I have to actually rephrase it. When you actually look at the way you treated the sort of the book tour of the first edition of the original book to now 10 years later, I mean, there was a lot of noise, digital noise in 2013, but probably less than today. Is there some sort of a different approach of both authors, like talking about the message of the book, being sort of the messengers?
No, I mean, when we undertook this, which was 2 years ago, so it was supposed to be a 2023 edition, and then because we still had it in our hands during the Credit Suisse SVB crisis, we ended up taking till last summer to finish it, and so it appeared only in early 2024. A very good friend, in discussing whether it made any sense to publish a little bit more and republish the book, said to me, this is somebody famous, but I won't tell the name, do it because it's the right thing to do, but set your expectations low. So that's what I remind myself all the time. I think that when I left the scene after 5-6 years of full-time lobbying on this one policy issue, to go back to corporate governance and to business education and think about what we're doing and what's wrong with that in 2015-16, I wrote one last op-ed and a few reflection pieces. One of them called "It Takes a Village to Maintain a Dangerous Financial System." And the other was about the Ben Bernanke book that came out that year called The Courage to Act, in which he congratulated himself for all the bailouts. And I said, where was the courage to stop a dividend of a bank? You didn't have that courage, or to even engage on the issues. So I was very disappointed. And Ben Bernanke was my colleague, so I know him well, or I knew him well. But anyway, and then I quit, basically. I mean, I would still write letters to the regulators and get engaged at the policy level, but not as much.
And even to Jamie Dimon.
And I did, and I did engage with him at his initiative, which I appreciated, but that's a whole other story and happened privately. But anyway, now I believe that my April 8th op-ed in Project Syndicate, which is available for free, called "Nonsense and Bad Rules Persist in Banking," is kind of my goodbye to this. I mean, it still plays out because I work on corporate enforcement and I speak about the Cum-Ex and governance in banks and all of that, and law evasion, that corporate settlements and all of that we discussed in the last chapter of the book, the one entitled "Above the Law." But on banking specifically, there's little I can do. If anything, things are going back. And, when we wrote the book back then, people were saying, well, it's too late for the last crisis. Your book will be there for the next crisis. Obviously, the crisis of SVB and Credit Suisse was not big enough to really raise too much attention. They bailed everybody out. They told us to go back to sleep.
But Credit Suisse was pretty big.
But it didn't. It was in the news for only a little bit. What it would take to get more political will to regulate banking better, I don't know. I am intellectually now tired of this topic, specifically in banking, and I'm interested more in corporations and rule of law and external and internal corporate governance, which is what I'm writing about right now, and challenging the approaches based on ESG and corporate law to say it's not enough. You need government action, which people do understand about sustainability and other things, but in general, and we have to focus our attention on making our governments work, is sort of my general conclusion in banking and beyond. So I'm irrelevant in banking. I had a little bit of influence. It's hard to compare what would have happened if we didn't write this book, if we didn't decide to get involved. So we don't have that counterfactual, but I do what I can do, and hitting myself against the wall, there's just at some point no point to it. I'll say what I have to say when given the opportunity, such as talking to you. Thank you. Otherwise, I teach students, and that gives me a lot of satisfaction. Because when people tell me, oh, it's too hopeless, I say, you know what? There are 150 undergraduate students at Stanford who are savvier about finance and savvier about the way politics works. And I'm sending them into the world. They're the young people. I'm an old lady. And let's hope that I planted a few seeds someplace. They'll go to policy, do good stuff, remember who they're working for, and remember the public good. And there are a lot of good people there. So, sometimes I get power.
Says Anat Admati. Thank you very much for being with us. And to our listeners and viewers, thank you for tuning in. See you next time.